Hello, today's date is November 30th, 2017. My name is Keith Van Hook. I'm a graduate student in the history program at Salem State University. We have the great pleasure of being joined by Vida Poole. She's a descendant of Rebecca Nurse, and we're here today as part of the Salem Witch Trials Descendant Oral History Project. So welcome, Vida. So we'll maybe start off by telling us a little bit about your background. What was life growing up in Cambridge?
Well, I'm an only child, so obviously
Okay.
it was a nice childhood. My father was a professor at MIT. He was a graduate student when I was young.
Smart man.
So there was a lot of involvement, I guess, around sort of academic issues. A lot of times when I had to be quiet while he was working on his thesis.
I'm sure.
But I had a different childhood, I think, from a lot of children today, my daughter included, who's about 30, because you could just open the door, you let your kids go out and play,
Yeah.
and there were very little structured
a lot,
after-school
yeah,
activities.
yeah.
So it was a good time.
Yeah, sounds like a nice way to grow up. And you mentioned you were an only child. So how did you discover that you were first a descendant of Rebecca Nurse, a victim of the Salem Witch Trials?
I don't really know how old I was, but I think that certainly my mother knew at some point, and again, I don't know if that was when she learned that. When you're a child, of course, there's sort of family things that people say, so it was more like, you're descended from a witch. And so there would be family things where people would say things like, if you had a premonition about something and it came true, you'd say, oh, well, that's because you're descended from a witch. So it was a very,
It's a little clue.
Sort of the child's version of
Right.
the witch trials.
Right, I see, yeah. Very interesting, very interesting. So, so this reality of your family's ancestry, was it something that the family embraced on a certain level, or was it generally kind of not something that wasn't discussed in general, maybe in public or with other people?
I don't know that we necessarily went around telling people. I probably did. I thought I was pretty special.
Sure, exactly. Yeah,
I think that
it's quite a thing, yeah.
Of course, not realizing at that point in my life how many people were, because you don't realize how, yes, you have two grandparents, but you
Sure.
sort of forget that they had two,
Exactly.
and how it
It goes all the
multiplies
way
the
back.
farther back you get. I think that certainly it wasn't discussed. But a lot of people in my family were interested in genealogy, my mother's side of the family. So I think bits and pieces came out probably over the years.
Interesting. So maybe we covered some of this, but how did you feel when you first learned that you were a descendant of Rebecca Nurse? Do you remember, or maybe say maybe the full sort of realization of who she was and what the Salem Witch Trials were, and when did that fully dawn on you?
Probably evolves, because certainly you start out with they were witches in a sense,
right.
And then you begin to, through probably initially just maybe articles you read or short pamphlets that you get, because I don't think I'm sure there were books that I could have read that I didn't know about.
Sure.
So then it begins to evolve, and you begin to learn really little bits and pieces over time from the sort of standard Salem,
Sure.
downtown Salem
Exactly.
history,
Yep.
quote unquote history information,
Yeah,
to
exactly.
starting to learn more, and then at some point, I know probably in college, I read The Crucible, because I
Yep.
heard, well, that's
That was the
sort
big
of connected.
Yep.
And
In the 50s, yeah. Very interesting, very interesting. So, so do you remember if the Salem Witch Trials were taught in your elementary or high school, and maybe how was it presented?
I don't really remember. I don't. And if it was very,
Probably general,
very sketchy.
yeah. Interesting,
Sort of
interesting.
this happened in Salem, and end of story.
Interesting. All right. So you mentioned that you attended American University, and that's right outside Washington, D.C. What did you study there?
French and art history, really practical for my future career.
As history in general is, yeah. That sounds really interesting. Yeah.
So I always had an interest in art, and knew I was not good enough to be an artist.
Right, right. Well, that's a great, Washington D.C. is a great place to be, to study that, so, very much so. Presumably, most of your American University classmates, they were from outside of Massachusetts and New England. Do you remember what maybe their knowledge level and perspective was on the Salem witch trials? Do you maybe did they know about the witch trials? Was it presented in your college classroom at all?
It wasn't presented. It would not have been presented probably in any of the courses that I took. And I'm not sure that it really came up. I mean, I was there during a period of a good deal of unrest.
That's right,
so
yeah.
That was much more probably prominent on people's minds.
See, that's really interesting in itself, though, because you get I think it tends to be, it's a very sort of part of New England heritage, and it's very important. But maybe when you get outside of New England, it's definitely known, but it's maybe not as central to people's upbringing or experience. It's very interesting. So about that unrest. So you attended school in Washington, D.C. during the late 60s and early 70s. It was one of the most tumultuous times in American history, as you know. So were you very active politically, and while there, did you make any connections to the Salem witch trials at all?
I wasn't particularly active politically. Other than totally different was trying to get people to sign on so that Washington D.C. would be able to vote. I got involved in that, but in terms of I wasn't part of taking over Ward Circle or any
all
of
the protests and everything. Do you remember the protests and everything?
Yes, because I remember tear gas coming through classroom windows and
crazy. It's
so,
crazy.
Yeah, I do, but I'm not somebody who takes action in that way.
Sure.
More
sort of in the
behind
background,
the scenes, petitions, calling your congressman.
Where the actual work gets done,
as opposed
exactly.
To, standing on a street corner. But.
Very interesting. What kind of reactions in general do you get when you tell people you were related to Rebecca Nurse, or when they find out?
Mostly people think it's interesting. It's sort of unusual, or you get the kind of "oh my, really" or something. I think that certainly, a few people at work know that, and they're like, oh, "You have a really interesting background," but there are other people that you meet that certainly have very interesting backgrounds, and I work with somebody who grew up on the. Pretty much, she's from Gettysburg, so she grew up right at the battlefield. Her whole family's from that area.
That's incredible. I love Civil War history.
So she has this incredible background.
Yeah, I've been there before. That's incredible.
Family that was that fought there, and sort of the Lincoln connection and everything. So
I'm sure there's just so many interesting stories you can find of people all over who have interesting ancestry and everything.
But I think mostly people don't know what to say. You say the Salem witch trials, and they say, "Well, that's interesting. You have an interesting background," and then they don't know what to say after that.
Exactly.
Really.
In terms of knowledge level, or just sort of, exactly.
Like they've heard of it.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those things that most people haven't gone into real depth on it, but it's fascinating to study. It's a fascinating period to study. So more than, given that more than 300 years have passed since the Salem witch trials, I'm really interested in the emotional connection. Do you feel an emotional connection to Rebecca Nurse and the trials, or do you generally, maybe once or maybe now, you view it dispassionately? It's interesting.
When my daughter was quite young, it would have been I guess the 300th anniversary. My mother, my daughter, and I went to they had a memorial commemorative service at the chapel in Danvers, and we just my mother and I thought we'd like to go. We wanted my daughter to go with us. We were stunned by how it was standing room only.
Wow.
And they were trying to bring in more chairs, and there was just no room there. And I think that really, in some ways, I'm not a religious person, but there was a certain sort of spiritual feeling, that came out of that event. And I know that I've gone to the property, and I've walked through the family graveyard out there, and there's something spiritual about that,
very
and I
interesting.
can't really put my finger on it.
Almost
but-
like just this sense of connection when you
Yeah.
go into, especially having a direct descendant, but when you go into a historic home or a historic site, there is that. It's Gettysburg. You mentioned Gettysburg. There is this sort of sacred feeling
Yeah.
that you get there. There's almost like this sort of like same sort of hushed kind of reverence. It's very interesting. Very interesting. So you mentioned that you have developed a broader interest in genealogy since finding out that you were a descendant of Rebecca Nurse. At what point in your life did this happen? And was it like a current event that sparked that, or anything in particular?
I think that, as I said, my mother had an interest in genealogy, and she had a cousin who was probably about 20 years older than she, who was very interested. She used to go to the old Essex Institute before they merged with the Peabody Museum and do a lot of research in their library.
It's amazing the resources you have up here, all the local historical societies and the genealogy and everything. It's really, really advanced.
So she would frequently send my mother little notes, not necessarily about the nurse side of it, but anybody sort of that she found or she was looking into at that point. My family we have a copy of the Preston book, and the connection for me is that Rebecca Nurse's daughter, Rebecca, married Thomas Preston, and so we're descended through that line.
Oh, interesting.
So I think the Preston book was written in, I don't know, the 30s or something, and so the family's always sort of collected bits and pieces of books that are related to different New England families. And then my mother's mother came from Maine, and my mother often would say, tell me about, great aunt so-and-so did this. So then I think as I probably late college, because I don't think you're not necessarily that interested in, you've got other things going on in your life.
Absolutely.
So,
as we mentioned, all the things going on back
so,
then. Yeah.
I began to sort of late college, and then once I was out of college, to sort of take notes when my mother would tell me all these different things. And then, as I think also then again, once my daughter was born, you have that desire to pass something on, let her know.
Absolutely.
And you're very aware that with each generation you lose the family lore. Not that the family lore is always true, but you lose.
It's important nonetheless.
You lose bits and pieces of things. So I actually then invested in a database, and I put her at the beginning, and I've been slowly trying to
Great, all this
fill in the blanks.
Technology, it's helped so much, and to organize everything.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So, what other noteworthy aspects of your genealogy have you discovered? Just any one particular instance, or?
I don't know that there's anybody noteworthy.
Sure.
There's some interesting characters along the way. My family actually, which has nothing to do with Rebecca Nurse, but my great-grandfather bought property on Martha's Vineyard where there was a brickyard, and he restored it. And so that's always been a sort of interest, is how many were there on that property before, and trying to collect the history around how it worked. It's now a ruin, basically.
Oh, okay.
But
yeah, even though we have, pretty much all of these stories can be interesting, even though, maybe not anybody famous, but, it's just always interesting to dig into our ancestry and find those little nuggets of interest. Yeah, definitely. So how would you feel if you were instead a descendant of maybe one of the judges or the prosecutors, or if that question is too difficult, that's fine. So how would you feel maybe in context?
well, I don't know if I'd go as far as Nathaniel Hawthorne and change my name, but
Sure.
I think I'd be uncomfortable about it.
Yeah,
think it
yeah, definitely.
I mean, I met somebody who the Genealogical Society ran a DNA conference last year, and he was telling me that I guess he discovered that he fit on both sides. You know, he had somebody who had apparently been a judge and somebody else who'd been a witness or something that is descended from.
Wow, that's interesting. How did he deal with, you know, that reality, or what was his?
Uncomfortable.
Yeah. I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine. Obviously you're aware of haunted happenings in Salem, the annual haunted happenings. So how do you feel about the annual haunted happenings in relation to the Salem witch trials, and sort of how the true history gets portrayed during those events?
Well, first of all, I always stay out of Salem.
Good idea.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I don't know, comparing Disneyland to an historic house in a sense. That's
exactly.
not, you know, it clearly is it's fun for people, I guess, who like to do it. It's not my thing, and it's sort of, it's tourism, it's exploitation of something
Sure.
that happened, but.
Yeah, I think that's the way some of the other participants express the same type of, I'm sure it's a very common feeling, yeah. Very interesting. So the Salem, how do you feel about like the portrayal of Salem witch trials in popular culture, maybe the Hollywood version, maybe, I know Arthur Miller's The Crucible, but how do you feel about how when the Salem witch trials are sort of portrayed in that way, or kind of, do you feel like it sort of gets away from the true meaning of the event, or?
Generally, probably. I mean, I think that it's much more complex than you can really relay, and any kind of media is going to sort of skip over, make certain things sensational.
The Hollywood version, yeah.
It's very complex.
Yeah.
You know, it really, the more you dig into some of the reading some of the testimony, not that I've read a lot of it, but reading some of the testimony, you feel bad to some degree for some of the people who were accusing people in a way too, because they got caught up in what was going on. Sort of victims of the culture back then. Yeah. I mean, everybody was a victim to some degree.
Exactly. Just kind of caught up in the whole ideology and everything. Yeah. So, what kind of do you feel that there are important lessons that we can learn from the Salem witch trials and the experience of Rebecca Nurse? Do you feel like there's something we can like learn from it to maybe correct some mistakes that we've made?
Interesting question. Well, certainly you can see how things built. I mean, I think that it sort of kept expanding. But obviously, there are a lot of things that are, in terms of the physical aspects, that are very different. I mean, we're not throwing people into prisons where they have to pay and they're starving.
Sure.
But certainly, I guess the Crucible would be an example of how we didn't learn the lesson to some degree. We keep, something happens, we keep at it, make sure that, more people get involved in whatever it is.
Right. Kind of an emotional kind of collective type of, accuse someone before they're given a fair trial.
And you can see how, I mean, years ago I worked at the aquarium, and it was a school group, and bunch of teenage girls, and one decided, I don't know, it smelled terrible, so she felt faint. And I think we had to bring something like 5 or 6 girls out of the building, because once one felt faint, they all felt faint.
Interesting.
And we were sort of, dragging these people out to fresh air and
Yeah,
making sure.
that's actually interesting because I was reading in Dr. Baker, who's a professor at Salem State. He has the book on the Salem witch trials that we read, and some of the modern explanations for what happened back then have used like different psychological explanations, for like mass psychosis and things like that. So that's interesting. That's sort of a real life example of that. So
it was, and I thought of the witch trials at that point. I thought, well, you can see how it sort of mushrooms. And
Yes.
it's like, well, if you have that problem, I have it too.
exactly. So. Well, I guess that just about wraps up our interviews for today.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much,
You're
and take care. Thank you for interviewing.
Thanks.